Because there were four of us. I'm from the first marriage when Dad was married to Betty McDonald, Elizabeth. When Jerry Lewis and my dad split up.
For decades, the world knew one Dean Martin. He was the king of cool, the impossibly handsome crooner with a twinkle in his eye and a whiskey glass that never seemed to leave his hand. He was a charter member of the legendary Rat Pack and the guy every man wanted to be and every woman wanted to be with. With a cigarette dangling from his lips and a voice as smooth as velvet, he sold a very specific brand of charisma. It was a brand built on effortlessness, on the idea that for some people, life was just one big glamorous party. His songs were the soundtrack for romance, his movies captivated audiences, and his laid-back charm defined an entire era of Hollywood. The image was so powerful, so complete, that it became the man himself. Or so it seemed. But what if it was all an act? What if that easy smile was just a mask for a deep sadness? What if the man who seemed to be the life of every party was actually a quiet soul who preferred solitude? For years, whispers and rumors have swirled about the real man behind the persona. Now, his own daughter, Deanna Martin, is finally setting the record straight. At 77 years old, she's confirming the heartbreaking truth we all suspected. In her book, Memories Are Made of This, and in a series of candid interviews, she's pulling back the curtain on her father, Dino Paul Crecchetti, the man from Steubenville, Ohio. The story she tells isn't about a carefree playboy, but a disciplined, professional, a strict father, and a man who, at the peak of his fame, was battling a profound loneliness that would shadow his final years. This is the confession of the real Dean Martin, told through the eyes of the person who knew him best. When you picture Dean Martin, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For most people, it's the charming, happy-go-lucky drunk. On stage, in Las Vegas, flanked by Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr., he'd stumble a little, lean on the piano, and slur just enough to get a laugh. That glass of amber liquid was as much a part of his costume as his tuxedo. He'd joke, "I feel sorry for you people that don't drink. When you wake up in the morning, that's as good as you're going to feel all day." The crowd would roar. It was his signature bit, the gimmick that made him so lovable within the sometimes intimidating Rat Pack. While Sinatra had that electric intensity, Dean's act made him seem accessible and eternally relaxed. But according to his daughter Dina, it was one of the greatest illusions in showbiz history. The truth is, the man on stage was almost never drunk. And that glass he held so lovingly, 9 times out of 10, it was filled with apple juice. Dina explained that the entire Dino persona was a carefully constructed bit. She said, when he started to redo his nightclub act, they just thought, we'll put a drink in his hand and a cigarette. Every man wanted to be him, and every woman wanted to be with him. It wasn't a lifestyle, it was a brilliant professional decision. Far from the undisciplined party animal he played, Dean Martin was the consummate professional. He was known for always being on time, always knowing his lines, and being one of the most reliable guys in Hollywood. Those drunken stumbles, the forgotten lyrics, the witty off-the-cuff remarks, it was all part of a meticulously rehearsed routine. Dean even admitted to the charade himself in a 1961 interview, detailing how his Vegas days started with a round of golf, not a bottle of scotch. He told the interviewer he'd have a slug of something that looked like scotch on stage, but it was just apple juice, followed by one real drink in the middle of his act. His kids have backed this up for years. His son Richie once said he never saw his father drunk. Diana remembers her father coming home for dinner every single night, where he and her mother would share a single cocktail before sitting down with the family. It was a life of quiet domesticity, a world away from the booze-soaked image he sold to the public. The greatest trick Dean Martin ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't care, when in fact, he was in complete control the entire time. If the drinking was a myth, the idea that Dean was the ultimate social butterfly was an even bigger one. As a core member of the Rat Pack, He was synonymous with the glitz of 1960s Las Vegas, a whirlwind of casinos, showgirls, and all-night parties with Frank and Sammy. In the public's imagination, Dean was always at the center of it all, laughing, charming, and soaking in the adoration. The reality, confirmed by Diana and his closest friends, was that Dean Martin was an intensely private and solitary man. He was a classic introvert who found the very parties he was famous for to be totally draining. He was there to do a job, perform, entertain, and keep up the image. But as soon as the show was over, all he wanted to do was escape. Story after you. Story describes how Dean would be the first to leave any party. While the rest of the Rat Pack carried on until dawn, Dean would quietly slip out the back and retreat to his hotel room. And he wasn't ordering more drinks or entertaining guests. Instead, he'd switch on the TV and lose himself in old westerns. This wasn't just a habit. It was his nightly routine. He was a homebody who just happened to work in the world's biggest party town. His son Richie told a famous story about how much his dad hated socializing at home. When his wife Jeanne would throw huge parties, Dean would stick around for an hour or two before sneaking upstairs, changing into his pajamas, and calling the police to report a noise disturbance at his own address, just so they'd break up the party. This need for solitude points to a deeper truth about him. In her memoir, Diana writes that while her father seemed to have it all, he seemed like the loneliest man in the world. It was a loneliness born from the massive gap between his public persona and his private self. He was reportedly shy about his lack of formal education and hated the intimacy of deep conversation. The king of cool was a shield, protecting the quiet, reserved Dino Crachetti from Steubenville. He played the part of the extrovert so well that nobody questioned it, but it was a performance that took everything out of him. Those quiet moments watching a John Wayne movie weren't just a preference. They were a necessity. The life of the party was, in reality, a man who couldn't wait for it to be over. The Dean Martin persona was all about carefree rebellion. He was the guy who flouted convention and lived life like one long, indulgent holiday. So, you'd probably assume his home life was the same. A place with no rules, where his kids ran wild. You couldn't be more wrong. In private, the king of cool was a strict, traditional, and deeply conservative Italian-American father. Diana Martin's memories of her childhood paint a picture that is completely at odds with the public myth. In the Martin house, there was no question who was in charge. Dean was a firm dad who set clear, unbending rules for his 8 children. Diana describes a home with strict curfews and a heavy emphasis on respect. He taught his children to always treat people the way you want to be treated. As Diana put it, he was an Italian dad. We all had a great sense of humor, but there was respect in our house. They were expected to say please and thank you, and they were definitely not, in her words, little brats. This strictness came from his role as a provider. Dean worked relentlessly to give his family a life he never had growing up during the Depression. When his kids were young, he was reportedly home for dinner every night at 6 p.m. on the dot. But this created a paradox. He was a devoted family man, but his demanding career often meant he was physically or emotionally absent. Dina has candidly described him as a good man, but not always a good father, admitting he could be aloof and distant. Despite the rules and his absence, the Martin home was also filled with warmth and a surreal kind of glamour. Dina and her siblings grew up with the Rat Pack as surrogate uncles. She fondly recalls Uncle Frank Sinatra and Uncle Sammy Davis Jr. being regular visitors. They weren't just famous colleagues, they were family. She shares memories of being around legends like Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe, and even dating Davy Jones of the Monkees. It was a childhood that was both completely normal in its paternal structure and totally extraordinary in its social circle. The same man who insisted on strict table manners would have Frank Sinatra over for dinner. This duality is the key to understanding the real Dean Martin. He built a fortress of traditional family values to protect his children from the very Hollywood chaos he ruled over. Before the Rat Pack, before he was a solo star, there was Martin and Lewis. From 1946 to 1956, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis weren't just a comedy duo. They were a phenomenon. They were the highest paid act in show business, conquering nightclubs, radio, TV, and film. Their formula was electric. Dean, the smooth-singing straight man, and Jerry, the manic, zany comedian. The public adored them and saw them as inseparable buddies. So when they broke up in 1956, exactly 10 years to the day after their first show, it was a seismic event. The truth of the split was far more painful than anyone knew, especially for Dean. From the start, Jerry idolized his partner. But as their fame exploded, the dynamic shifted. Critics praised Jerry as the genius of the team, while often dismissing Dean's role as secondary. In one particularly stinging moment, a magazine cover was cropped to cut Dean out of a photo, leaving only Jerry. For Dean, a proud and talented performer, this was deeply insulting. He felt like he was being reduced to a prop for Jerry's antics. The professional frustration quickly poisoned their friendship. Dean felt Jerry was becoming too controlling and taking him for granted. The easy chemistry they had on stage was masking a growing bitterness behind the scenes. During their final movie, they reportedly weren't even speaking to each other off camera. The breaking point came during a vicious argument when Dean, completely fed up, looked at his partner and said, "To me, you're nothing but a dollar sign." The bond was shattered. For the next 20 years, the two men didn't speak a word to each other. That painful divorce shaped the rest of Dean's career. It reinforced his natural dislike for deep emotional attachments and strengthened his need for independence. Having been overshadowed in one partnership, he made sure that in the Rat Pack, he was part of a team but always his own man. Their story did, however, get a poignant final chapter. In 1976, during Jerry Lewis's annual telethon, Frank Sinatra stunned everyone by bringing Dean out on stage for a surprise reunion. The two men, older and visibly emotional, shared a brief, awkward, but deeply moving embrace as the audience went wild. They would reunite again more privately years later, after the tragic death of Dean's son, when Jerry attended the funeral to support his old friend. It was a quiet end to a long feud, a final acknowledgement that their decade together had been something special. Of all the hidden sorrows in Dean Martin's life, none compares to the tragedy that struck him in his later years, a blow from which he would never recover. By the 1980s, Dean was an elder statesman of entertainment. He was still a beloved performer, but he'd mellowed. He had 8 children, but his son Dean Paul Martin, or Dino, held a special place in his heart. Dino was the golden boy, a man who seemed to inherit all of his father's gifts. He was handsome, charismatic, a musician, an actor, and, his father's proudest achievement, a captain in the California Air National Guard. His father once said, "I'm proud of him. I'd be proud even if he didn't become a jet pilot, because he's a good boy." Then, on March 21, 1987, the unthinkable happened. During a routine training mission, the F-4 Phantom jet piloted by 35-year-old Dean Paul Martin crashed into a mountain during a snowstorm. Both he and his partner were killed instantly. When Dean Martin got the news, the vibrant light that had defined him for 50 years went out for good. This is the ultimate confession Deanna Martin makes. The death of his son broke her father. The man who had built an image of unshakable cool was plunged into a grief so deep he could never escape it. Friends and family watched, helpless, as Dean retreated into himself. The private, solitary man he'd always been now became a full-blown recluse. His friend, singer Paul Anka, said that Dean Paul's death was a huge turning point. Frank Sinatra, his truest friend, tried desperately to pull him out of his depression, but the famous smile was gone, replaced by a vacant sadness. He briefly joined Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. for a reunion tour, but his heart just wasn't in it. After just a few shows, he quit, leaving his friends to go on without him. In an interview, Dean struggled to articulate the pain, saying, "When you hear about somebody passing away, you say, 'That's a terrible thing.' But when it strikes home, it eats you up." He tried to carry on, but the spark was gone. An author who befriended him in his final years described him as a candle without a flame. He spent his evenings dining alone at his favorite restaurant, a solitary figure lost in his memories. He kept telling people he'd be back on stage one day, but it was a promise he couldn't keep. His health declined, and he withdrew from public life. Dean Martin passed away on Christmas Day, 1995. Many, including his daughter, believe he died not from his ailments, but from a broken heart. The final heartbreaking truth about the King of Cool was that he was, in the end, a grieving father, whose greatest loss silenced his music forever. Dean Martin's story is a powerful reminder that behind every public persona, there's a real human being fighting battles we know nothing about. The legends we think we know are always more complex and fascinating than the myth. If you agree, and you love getting to the real story behind Hollywood's greatest icons, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss our next look into the truths behind the legends of classic Hollywood. So, who was the real Dean Martin? Was he the whiskey-swigging crooner from Las Vegas? Or was he Dino Crocetti, the quiet son of Italian immigrants? The truth his daughter Dina has so bravely shared is that he was both, and he was neither. He was a walking contradiction. The sober drunk, the introverted life of the party, the strict dad with the playboy image, and the king of cool, who was ultimately broken by a father's grief. His legacy isn't just in timeless songs like "Everybody Loves Somebody" or in his classic films. His true legacy lies in the masterful, lifelong performance he gave. He created one of the most beloved personas of the 20th century, a character so complete it overshadowed the man himself. But thanks to the honest memories of his daughter Diana, we can now appreciate the full picture. With her memoir, and with talk of it being developed into a film, she has dedicated herself to preserving the memory of the real man, the hard-working, disciplined, loving, and ultimately tragic figure behind the myth. The story of Dean Martin is a lasting lesson that we can never truly know the hearts of the people we only see on screen.